We're stopping here at Lock 51, about a mile west of Jordan. We're going to be taking a look at this. I wanted to go down to Lock 52, but with the throughway there, it's so noisy that we can look at Lock 51, see a lot of the same features that we would find in Lock 52. We'll get over Lock 52 shortly. This is an enlarged Erie Canal lock, twinned, meaning they had chambers side by side. So that way they could have boats going east and west going through the locks. On the original canal, Clinton's Ditch, they had one lock, and so boats going east and west had to take turns going through the locks, and that caused a lot of backups and a lot of headaches. Famous fights on the Erie Canal. So when they enlarged the canal, they put in the side-by-side locks. These also were bigger. They lengthened the locks from 90 to 110 feet, and they made them wider by a couple feet, so they're 18 feet wide, allowing boats to double or triple in size, carrying more goods. And it's just very classic construction with the cut stone, very smooth stone. And if you saw the Cougar Lock 7 or Cougar Lock 11 over in Montezuma with the composite construction, where the cut stone or the rough stone and the wood walls, this is just completely different. So let's head down inside. Alright, so we parked up there. There's the parking lot, there's Route 31. It's also the Canalway Trail. The Canalway Trail is also over here, but the trail in this area isn't in such great shape, so most people who are traveling across the state will follow Route 31. So this lock is very accessible. It's very nice. It's actually in very good shape too. So let's take a little tour here down through it. All these locks are built on a fairly standard blueprint, that we might call it boilerplate. They all have to be the same width. They all have to be the same length. You couldn't have one that was half as wide, because the boats were fairly standard. They were 17 and a half feet wide. They drafted 6 feet or so, and they were 98 feet long. So you couldn't have one lock that was twice the size or half the size. So they're all pretty standard. So when you're looking at them, the differences to look for are maybe just construction details, what kind of stone they used, how they fit the stone blocks together. I mean, kind of geeky stuff, but that's what it is. One of the most noticeable thing about these enlarged locks are these 3 openings. And the 3 openings are always at the head of the lock, meaning the upstream side. So by looking at this, I know that this was the upstream side. I'm looking back towards Jordan. Jordan was a mini summit. So let me try to explain that if you're not familiar with little summit levels. The canal starts in Lake Erie about 550 feet above sea level. And it's going to step down, 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 all the way to the Hudson River at Albany, about 1 or 2 feet above sea level. Along the way, it's not a normal step down, typical step down, down. There are a couple humps in the way. One of the humps, or summits, what we call, is at Jordan, where the canal actually has to step up through a couple locks to reach Jordan. Then it goes back down through Lock 50 to Syracuse and Onondaga Lake down that way. And then it steps back up through 49, 48, and 47 to reach the Rome summit. And once it reaches Rome, then it steps down all the way to Albany. So what that means in practical sense is that Lake Erie water could reach as far as the foot of Lock 52 in Port Byron. If you saw the Montezuma videos, you would know that the Lake Erie water would reach the Seneca River at the Slackwater crossing and then dump into there. But here, or with the enlarged canals, with the aqueduct in place, the water could actually, Lake Erie water could actually make it as far as Lock 52 in Port Byron. So we have water feeding into the canal from Skinny Atlas Lake. Water feeds down through the Skinny Atlas feeder, and right in the village of Jordan, there's where the feeder enters into the canal. So water is replenishing this section of canal, and when the canal locks are in typical use, you know, each lockage uses a certain amount of water, which flushes downstream to replenish the water downstream. But when the canals or the lock is not in use, when the gates are closed, the water's still pouring in. It's just coming in because they just leave the gates open up there. There's no automatic regulation. It's all manual. Somebody has to go close the gates. So the water needs a regulating device, and that's what these three openings are. So we're going to walk over here. Try to climb up here. The one nice thing about Lock 51 is you can do this. Lock 52, you sort of have to climb up, which is kind of forbidden. They don't want you doing that. But you can see this culvert, this very nice stone culvert at the bottom of this pit here. And what would happen is water, once it got up to 7-foot depth, it would reach the bottom of these openings and just simply flow over down through that culvert to the other end of the lock and just keep flowing downstream, replenishing the canal downstream. Now the stone pile here was here in the original, when the canal was in operation, but there would have been a wooden deck around it to protect the boats from, one, to help guide the boats into the lock chambers, but also, you know, you wouldn't want your canal boats running up on the rocks like that. So there was a wooden deck around them, and you can see that in a lot of the photographs of the canal when it was in operation. Then we have the 1847's lock. This lock was opened right after the Stop and Tax Act of 1842 was sort of kiboshed, and Reed started working on the canal again. So we see this beautiful cut stone, and this was all done probably early 1840s. So we're going to walk down here. Let me stop here. Just take a look at this. Canal gates fit into these pockets. The gates had to fold out of the way, and if you're familiar with the barge canal locks, they're the same way. The gates fit back into these pockets. And you'll see that the stone here is kind of square cut, and over here it's got like a roundness to it. That's the hollow coin post, and that was a hinge for the lock gate. So there'd be a lock gate over here and a lock gate here, and they would just form up on a miter, which is like a 45-degree angle. And so what happens, and the same thing happens today in the barge canal, when the lock is filled up, that water pressure pushes against the doors, forcing them together, and that's what makes a watertight seal and allows you to fill the lock without a lot of leakage going by. And Camillus has the set of lock gates they pulled out of Lock 50. We got the bottom half of them, not the top half. Top half is rotted away, but the bottom half with the paddle doors can still be seen there. The gates will come into play a little bit later when we talk about hydraulic forces in the lock. But let's take a look at the other end of this culvert here. Lock 52, you cannot see this culvert, and this is a nice thing about Lock 51 is you can see the end of this, back end of this culvert here. Walk down, and we just point our way in here. Real nice stone culvert. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. That was where the pit was, where we showed you the head end. So this culvert's about 110 feet long, goes right down the middle of the island. At Lock 52, the stone is filled right up to the top arch. A couple years ago, you could see the top stones there in the arch, but Now that they've dressed it up even more, you can't see that at all. Let's work our way back around here through the Phragmites. So what I'm going to do is work my way around to the foot of the other chamber because of the Phragmites here and talk about the lock lengthening. Alright, so now we've worked our way around to the bottom end of the berm side chamber. There's two side-by-side chambers from the original enlargement. And then you'll notice that one of the chambers is twice as long as the other. This chamber here is 220 feet long, and the one over here, the 1847 chamber, is 110 feet long. And the reason for this was because in the 1870s, 1880s, boatmen found it was more efficient to tie two boats together into one big boat, in one effect making two 100-foot boats into one 200-foot long boat. And the state responded by building these enlarged chambers so the boatmen could fit both boats in through the lock at one time instead of having to break the boats apart at each lockage, saving effort, time for the boatmen and effort on the mules and everything. This whole process was in competition with canals along the St. Lawrence River. The canals are being maintained by Canada, province of Canada, because they were competing with the Erie Canal in effect. The St. Lawrence River has been there forever, draining the Great Lakes, but with the rapids and stuff, couldn't get up through it, and that's why the Erie Canal was so successful early on, because it was basically making a shortcut from New York City to the Great Lakes. But as technology improved and they started coming up with steam engines, and they were able to improve the St. Lawrence canals to the point where they were in direct competition with the Erie Canal. So since these locks were already built, the state wasn't going to make them deeper and wider and longer. So the only thing they could do was extend them, just add another chamber, and as I said, in a sense, putting two boats through here at one time. And sometimes you'll see pictures where 3 mules instead of 2 are pulling a boat, and usually that's when the 3 mules are pulling one big boat that's about 400 tons worth of goods. So you see these extended or lengthened chambers, and they all have a date, started in 1880s, 1884, so, and that whole process didn't end until the late 1890s. Over on this side, in lock 52, we got a postcard showing the wooden deck that was out here. They see the back side of this is all cut stone, or not cut stone, it's all rough stone. And it's so what they had was a wooden deck that sat out here so the lock tenders could walk up on top of that wooden deck, and it'll just be a cheaper way to make these extensions. Gears lock 50, just coming out of Syracuse, they did extend that whole island another 110 feet, in a sense doubling the size with all stone. And then they also had to double the length of the culvert, and just a lot of extra expense that they figured the accountants said, hey, find ways to cut cost, and so wood is cheaper than stone. So that's what you'll see these lengthened chambers with the wooden deck on them. The other thing you can see about the lengthened chambers, and I don't know if all the lengthened chambers are built the same way, but you see these pick marks in the middle of the stone. And what they were doing, it appears to be, they had like an ice pick or an ice tong where they could just grab a hold of that stone, and that was like the balancing point. And they would just grab a hold of that stone, and just be a quicker, easier way than trying to sling the stone or however else they were setting it. And the 1847s, the original chambers don't have that. So it was just an innovation they made to make the walls quicker, handle the rocks or the stones easier. This lock here has a lift of 5.5 feet, 6 feet, whereas the one, lock 52 in Port Byron, had a lift of about 11.5 feet. that created all kinds of issues because, as I said, the water's coming in from Skinny Atlas Lake. It's got to pass through this lock and then pass through 52 because the water's flowing downhill. So as a boat enters 52, say a fully loaded boat enters 52, it's coming to the east. It uses twice the amount of water that this lock here is passing. So for every boatage, every lockage, the lock 52 is using twice the amount of water that 51 is using for the same lockage. And that just created issues for water management because then what do? You don't want to put extra water in above this lock because then you start flooding out the banks, but you still have to figure out ways to account for that twice the amount of water used at lock 52. And that's when the state brought in the Owasco feeder at Port Byron in 1864, just a way to fill the chambers, fill the canal a little faster and to regulate it a little bit easier. So as we come back along the top of the lock to return to our car, just a couple things to note. See in the head of the lock here where the openings are, that square hole, that's where the shaft came up. But then they've cleaned out the top of this lock, so it looks pretty good. There would have been a little lock tender's office, a little shack. That shack is actually still in existence. It's down by the Jordan School. If you go back to the Jordan School, you'll see it over there on the side of the parking lot. Still in pretty good shape. They were, the people down at Camillus Erie Canal Park, they took measurements off that and recreated one there for their park. But the original one there is in Jordan. We're going to walk along here. There is a mystery here on this lock. There is this depression, and the tunnel hasn't collapsed, so we don't know why there is this depression here at the foot of the lock, but there it is. And you can also see where that capstan was there in the gate opening. See these staples, these iron staples that were put in here to try to reinforce the connection between the stone. They were driven into holes and then lead was poured into the hole to help hold them in place. As I said, on the lock 52 is nowhere near as accessible as lock 51, so it's worth coming over. If you're athletic enough, you could climb up on top of the island over there if you want to see that. Just take a quick view down this way. See those, more of those rope burns in the rock there. And all the locks have that. It's just years and years and years of tow ropes rubbing against the rocks there. So there you go, your lock overview for enlarged Erie Canal locks and lengthened enlarged Erie Canal locks. Stop in and see them. Every lock is, you know, even though they're the same blueprints, each one is a little different. Each one is well worth seeing. Because if you're following Route 31 to the west of Jordan and Port Byron, you'll go past a number of locks. Lock 51, 52, 53 in Clyde, 54 and New Berlin there, and there's a couple Newark. I mean, they just follow Route 31, you'll find a whole bunch of them. What we call the ancient Mayan ruins of the Erie Canal. That's it for now.